You think justice in a courtroom ends when the gavel falls. Think again. It was a bright April afternoon in Charleston, West Virginia. The kind of day that makes people believe in second chances. Jodi Greene, a lawyer with a mouth for truth and a heart for the little guy, walked out of the county courthouse having just handed down a decision that would change more than one life. 16 years later, the person who took her from a world was standing under a different sky in another state, handcuffed, and the whole town, the same town that whispered her name into empty pews and at kitchen tables, collapses into shock. But here's the part you won't see coming. The arrest doesn't close the book. It rips open pages that no one wanted read, secrets stitched into official files, a clue someone hid in plain sight, and a single question that refuses to die. Who really ordered the violence that silenced Jodi Greene? Stay with me, because when the past finally catches up, it reveals not just a killer, but a choice someone made that night. And that choice points to something far bigger than one act of rage. Before we dive deeper, take a second to hit subscribe and smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming your way. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. You can feel Charleston before you see it. The slow ache of the Canal River, the brick facades, the courthouse steps where people make and break reputations. In 2002, Jodi Greene was one of those reputations. A 37-year-old lawyer with a steady voice and a restless compassion. She kept the kind of smile that softened heated hallways and the kind of stubborn that kept judges awake. People in town said she had the look of someone who'd been born ready to fight for the truth. That spring she stood in front of a packed courtroom to deliver a ruling in a case that had become a bitter scalp between the municipal machine and a handful of homeowners. The case itself was dry on paper. Zoning changes, gone wrong contracts, a messy chain of responsibility. But it had become a moral brawl. Jodi was not interested in the politics. She saw the petitioners as neighbors, not numbers. Her judgment favored the small, the overlooked, and the scared. People in the gallery cried, some out of joy, others because they knew bodies in the system would hurt over the fallout. When she walked out, the courthouse plaza hummed with routine, pedestrians clicking past. A city that thinks small tragedies are contained. Jodi climbed into her gray sedan, the midday light catching on the last page of the opinion as if to bless it. She had a meeting with a client, a dinner to prepare, a voicemail to return. None of those things would happen. Her body was discovered later that evening by a street sweeper, tucked between two dumpsters behind a restaurant less than a mile from the courthouse. She hadn't been robbed. There were no witnesses willing to speak. The forensics team found evidence that told them she had been attacked after leaving the courthouse, but it offered no face, no DNA that matched any database, no latent print that produced a name. The city was stunned. The police labeled the case a homicide. The press called it a high-profile, unsolved murder. And the weeks that followed produced a slow feed of theories, prayers, and the kind of gossip that bullies truth. Jodi's funeral was a white blur of suits, law books, and faces that carried grief like a public uniform. Her mother cried until she couldn't form the sound. Her closest friends murmured that she hadn't deserved to die like this, that a life of fighting for others didn't earn her an end like some closed file. The case file grew thick with interviews and dead ends. Detectives tapped down alleyways, combed through courthouse security footage that was grainy even by 2002 standards, and drove out to talk to anyone who had a reason to hate a lawyer who kept her ethics sharp. They found motives scattered like embers, a disgruntled client who'd gone broke after a ruling, a local contractor who'd lost a bid, a county official embarrassed in public. But motive does not equal proof. The trail ran dry. For 16 years, the file lived under a desk in a police records room. Photographs, typed reports, hand-scribbled leads, and a brittle, cherished copy of Jodi's last ruling. The town moved on the way small towns do. There were new faces at the diner, a coffee shop replaced a barber, and the courthouse steps kept bearing people who thought the law was a place of closure. But closure for Jodi's family never came. Her mother kept answering the phone at odd hours, waiting to hear the wrong number that would say, "We found him." Friends placed flowers on the bench outside the courthouse. A photographer at the local paper called it a wound that time bandages but never heals. Then in 2018, a small, technical revolution found its way into that dusty folder. Forensic genealogy had been used to crack other cold cases around the country. It's not magic. It's patience and an array of genetic hints, a mosaic created from fragments of DNA and family trees. A court order and a careful, ethically reviewed search through databases gave detectives a thread. The thread led from a distant relative to a neighborhood, from a neighbor to a license plate, and from that vehicle to a man named Luke Ramsey, a 40-something mechanic who had lived and worked on the outskirts of Charleston before drifting across the river to Cincinnati. Luke wasn't a public figure. He wasn't the kind of person who drew headlines. He had a record for small-time assaults and a life that included bitter arguments and a reputation for temper. People who knew him said he could be private and sometimes sharp when cornered. Detectives moved with the caution of people who know how fragile cases are. They surveilled, gathered, and built a case. They sent the old evidence, the fibers, the trace hairs, the swabs, to a modern lab with tools that Jodi's era had not possessed. The results came back with a clarity that the old photographs did not afford. A hair matched Luke's DNA, and that match was the rope that pulled him into the light. In the twilight of a Cincinnati morning, police arrested him outside a convenience store. They placed a cuff on his wrist. He put up a quiet resistance that said less about guilt and more about the defense of a life that had been pushed to the wall. News traveled like wildfire. Charleston woke up all at once. Some people stayed in their houses and cried. Others gathered in small knots outside the courthouse, holding candles that mimicked the length of their prayers. The sheriff called a press conference and promised a thorough prosecution. Jodi's mother, who had aged as if time had taken a bite out of her, said, "Only we have waited for the truth." But truth, it turned out, was complicated. Luke's first court appearance was a theater of human contradictions. He was thin, his jaw worked like he was chewing down something he wished he hadn't swallowed. He refused to speak to reporters. His attorney said nothing unusual, the mandatory plea to the complexity of facts. Yet, as reporters left, someone who had known Luke years ago said under their breath, he'd seen what happens when you get in the way of the machine. He'd always looked like someone haunted by a day he couldn't forget. The arrest did not sit like a clean bookend on the town's grief. Instead, it cracked open more questions. Why would Luke attack a woman he didn't know? A respected lawyer with no known personal grudge. Where had the link come from? And the most bitter question, if Luke did it, who had sent him? Or, and this is the part that made people go quiet, could one small man's violence be the final note in a longer, quieter orchestration? The prosecution painted a simple arc in media briefings. Jodi's judgment had cost someone money, that someone had been bitter. Luke had acted in anger. Simpler stories soothe. But the investigators who had kept the file alive were careful not to promise narrative neatness. They had learned that, in their line of work, causes rarely begin at the point of violence. They begin in meetings and whispered deals, in favors owed and grudges cultivated. They bloom where power and money live. During the weeks leading to the trial, a swarm of new evidence surfaced, not because someone suddenly remembered or confessed, but because someone ordinary did something extraordinary. They handed over a flash drive. The drive contained recordings not of the murder, but of conversations and meetings, recorded years earlier and kept as insurance by a municipal contractor who had since left town. The recordings were grainy, the kind of thing you might mistake for bad reception if you weren't listening for consequence. In them, two voices could be heard arguing about the fallout from Jodi's ruling. One voice spoke with official knowledge and a calm that suggested experience. The other voice, the contractor's, sounded pressured, afraid of losing business. There's talk of making sure the issue goes away, and a line that sent chills through the detective assigned to review it. You know, people, you can make sure it's handled. The contractor swore the recording captured only intimidation. The detective could not help but hear differently. Now imagine the courthouse corridors as if they were strings. Pull one, and others respond. The recording suggested a link not between Luke and Jodi personally, but between Luke and someone who had access to power, an official who could bend contracts, a man with the ability to put a favor in an envelope. Detectives expanded their canvas. They sought bank records, emails, and the whispers of men who once had been able to keep things quiet. They interviewed former county employees, contractors, and men who had shaken hands with those in office. People who had once been willing to lie for a living suddenly found their stories morally heavy. The passage of time had loosened tongues. At a late-night hearing, the prosecution announced they had new witnesses willing to testify about a chain of payments that might link municipal decisions to the man arrested. Defense attorneys screamed that the case was now theater, that the police were stitching together coincidences because they wanted answers. Families, however, took on an expression I had seen only twice in my work: tentative hope. Hope because someone had been arrested. Cautious because the matter now looked less like a straightforward crime and more like a scab pulled from under which something ugly had festered. In interviews, Jodi's mother did not celebrate the arrest as justice. Justice is more than a name, she said. It's truth. And truth, when exposed to light, can split open cleanly or crumble in the hands that try to hold it. Courtroom testimony in 2019 became a slow, dusty examination of the town itself. People who once kept their heads down were asked to look up and answer for their choices. Men in suits who had once passed folders across tables now sat with thin faces and shorter answers. A contractor admitted he had paid intermediaries to smooth over problems for projects that had been threatened by Jodi's ruling. An intermediary, not a politician, but someone who moved in and out of city departments, testified that a conversation about making sure the problem didn't cause trouble had been about more than smoothing paperwork. It was, she said, about influence. None of this proved Luke's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt in the eyes of everyone in the room. But it made the jury see the murder not as an isolated onion, but as layers. Yet the piece everyone wanted. Why that night? Why Jodi? Why hand around a throat or a sudden blow? Remained stubbornly opaque. Luke's defense rested on the argument that even if he had been at the scene, and the DNA evidence made that hard to deny, he had been acting on a different kind of provocation. He claimed he had been hired, coaxed into doing a short-lived job by people who told him what they wanted. He painted himself as a ghost of a man who had been paid to frighten someone, not to kill her. Prosecutors countered with evidence of intent and presence. The jury listened, and the town kept holding its breath. Outside the courtroom, a movement had begun to unfurl. It wasn't a march or a loud protest. It was quiet. Letters to the editor that asked for transparency, local ministers demanding hearings, and citizens filing petitions to audit municipal contracts from the years around Jodi's case. The arrest had done what painful events sometimes do. It forced a community that preferred to forget to remember with careful eyes. People began to ask whether the systems meant to protect them had, instead, protected those who would exploit them. There were nights when Jodi's mother sat on the courthouse bench and touched the carved initials, as if they were Braille. She used to say law is a language you speak for people who can't, her mother told me once, her voice an old crack. I just want to know who was speaking for her when she couldn't speak anymore. The prosecution's theory rested on a tapestry of circumstantial and forensic threads. The DNA, now modern, placed Luke at the scene. The flash drive suggested discussions about handling the fallout. The chain of payment suggested that someone had motive to silence a woman whose decisions would cost money and influence. The defense argued the payments were routine, that men used hyperbole, that Luke had a history of violence but was not a killer. In quiet corners, however, people spoke of the smell of fear that travels fast in small towns, when someone powerful tells someone weak to make a problem disappear. That phrase can echo until someone acts it into reality. And then, the unexpected twist. An anonymous letter arrived for the detectives. It was the kind of thing that both energized and terrified investigators. A map of sorts hand-drawn, with a single date and the words, "You were wrong to close your eyes." The letter claimed that someone had watched Jodi for weeks, noting times she left the courthouse and met with clients. It suggested the murder was not random, not even an act of a single angry man, but part of a plan. It threw suspicion like a rock into a pond. The ripples reached everyone who'd had dealings with the courthouse that spring in 2002. The anonymous tip could have been a hoax. It could have been the desperate writing of someone who enjoyed seeing chaos. Detectives did the only thing they could. They followed it. The map led to a storage unit on the outskirts of Charleston that had once belonged to someone who now claimed bankruptcy and a new life out of state. Inside the unit, wrapped in tarps and stale plastic, were boxes of old invoices, phone logs, and astonishingly, an old security badge from a county department with a name that appeared on the flash drive. The storage unit smelled of dust and secrets. The discovery of the badge did not prove conspiracy, but it did paint a picture that was no longer comfortably simple. People started to murmur about meetings in back rooms, chain payments, and favors swapped like currency. The town's leaders found themselves questioned in a way they had not anticipated. They were asked not to defend their reputations, but to account for choices. The case, which had once been narrowly about a murder, had widened into an inquiry about the cost of convenience. Luke was convicted in 2020. The jury found causation and presence persuasive, and he was sentenced to life. For some, justice had been served. For others, the conviction felt like a step in a longer staircase, a step that might lead to a landing where truth finally stood in the open. Jodi's mother, the day the sentence was read, did not clap. She held a folded program from the funeral as if it were a compass. "It's something," she said quietly, "but it is not everything." The curious thing about endings is that they are rarely endings. The conviction left open more doors than it closed. Lawyers on both sides appealed, files were re-examined, and the public, who had once felt certain, learned to live with the uncomfortable knowledge that there might be layers still under the floorboards. People began to accept that the town might only ever see a portion of what had happened. Then, on an ordinary Thursday, a young journalist who had covered the trial from the start made a discovery that would pull the story into a new orbit. While rummaging through public records, she found an obscure set of minutes from a private meeting in 2001 that had not been part of the public ledger. The minutes made mention of a project the city planned to push through that would be affected by Jodi's coming decisions. The people present were a small constellation of contractors and a consultant who, the minutes suggested, had a role in smoothing the path. The consultant's name was unfamiliar to most, but the journalist dug deeper and found a paper trail that linked that consultant to the intermediary who testified during the trial. Suddenly, the consultancy became not background noise, but a possible amplifier. The thread led the journalist to a man who now lived in another state, someone with a tidy life, a boat docked by a quiet marina, and a past tied to the courthouse in ways he preferred to forget. When approached, he denied wrongdoing. But the journalist, persistent and careful, uncovered emails that, while not direct orders, suggested someone in his position could have known the fallout that would come from Jodi's decision and could have made choices to protect clients. It was the kind of evidence that invites questions but resists the blunt force of a criminal charge. And that is where the cliffhanger waits. Luke Ramsey sits in prison, his presence a bookend to the violence that took Jodi from her family. He will spend years in a cell that offers little to the outside world. The town has reclaimed some sense of safety, and yet parts of the story still smell of hidden rooms. The consultant with a quiet life has never been charged. The recordings exist, the payments were real, and a trail of whispers threads through county offices and contractors. People who remember Jodi say her name like a talisman. Families of others who quietly watched their livelihoods shift whisper that they too had been compromised by a system that sometimes prizes profit over people. If you look at the file now, you see two kinds of ink. The forensic black that names presence and the dull red of relationships that hint at motive. The law can punish a man for the act he committed, but cannot always name the moral architecture that allowed that act to be conceived. In the end, the town of Charleston had to hold two truths at once. The man who committed the violence had been identified and convicted, and the larger question, who asked for the violence, who benefited from her silence, was still being asked. So here's the cliffhanger that keeps this story alive. A second set of recordings, more deliberate and far clearer than the ones that came before, has been whispered into the hands of someone trusted. They have been held back from the court to avoid prejudicing a retrial motion that could come from defense attorneys. They contain a voice that might belong to someone no one suspected, a voice with a calm cadence of influence, the kind of voice that doesn't shout, but moves things into place. Prosecutors sit on the edge of what to do next, reveal the recordings and risk losing the conviction already won, or hold them and let the possibility of broader accountability wait until they build an ironclad case. Jodi's mother sits in a pew at a small church and folds her hands until the knuckles fade white. She talks sometimes to a woman who isn't there to her daughter. She says every so often, "I want the whole truth, not just enough to sleep, the whole truth." And that is where we leave the story for now. Not with tidy closure, but with a question that steadies like a cold hand on the back of the neck. Luke Ramsey was convicted, but someone's voice, calm, careful, possibly connected, remains out of reach. A shadow that might explain why a woman who sought fairness in papers and people was silenced the way she was. The town of Charleston waits, not in silence so much as in watchful expectation. Because when a community finally opens the drawer marked with its most uncomfortable affairs, what spills out can be small and messy, or it can be the beginning of a reckoning. If you want to know what the second set of recordings says, if you want to learn how families cope when the line between justice and truth blurs, and if you want to see how a small town decides whether to forgive the past or rescue it from the hiding place where it's been kept, come back. Because the next chapter does not only answer who's responsible. It asks what we are willing to do when we learn that the systems we trust may have been the ones that failed us first. When the second set of recordings finally moved from rumor into the hands of prosecutors, the town of Charleston felt its pulse quicken in a way that was almost painful. It wasn't simply the possibility of naming another guilty party. It was the sudden, intimate feeling of standing too close to a wound and seeing the thread that had been stitched across it for years. People spoke in hushed clusters, as if too loud words might scare the evidence away. Maya Torres, the young journalist who had refused to let the story die in files, sat in her car outside the county courthouse and pressed her palms to the steering wheel until the leather left the print of her fingers. She had followed this case for 7 years. She'd watched Jodi's mother age beneath her headlines. She had sat through pre-trial hearings and listened to men in suits tell different sides of the same half-truths. Now finally, there was a recording that prosecutors said might change everything. The defense barked that playing the tapes would prejudice the jury. The prosecution insisted the public had the right to know the threads of a crime that had spent a decade and a half wrapped around the town's throat. The judge, a stern woman whom everyone respected for her patience with small-town theatrics, scheduled a public evidentiary hearing, the kind that draws citizens like moths to a porch light. Cameras lined the hallway. The court's live stream server groaned under more viewers than it had ever seen for a local proceeding. Inside, the room smelled of old wood and colder things. Fear, anticipation, the bright metallic tang that comes before a revelation. Jodi's mother sat in the front row with a friend on each side, their hands linked like a chain. Luke Ramsey watched from the gallery, his shoulders a small thing under the orange scrubs he'd worn to hearings. He had been brought from the detention center and now, after conviction, came only to testify when called. Maya sat near the back, recorder on, finger steady. The town's mayor, some county commissioners, the press, all of them packed into a room that felt too small for the gravity of what might be unspooled. When the prosecutor hit play, the first few seconds were static. Then a voice settled into the room, familiar to anyone who'd spent time in those corridors. Measured, practiced, the sort of voice that had commanded meetings and signed checks for decades. It belonged to Gideon Price, the consultant whose name had been a whisper in so many lists. Men who did favors for men who did favors for men. Gideon had been the ghost in so many town stories. He'd advised campaigns, smoothed municipal snafus, and in his quietest moments, collected statements like currency. On the recording, Gideon spoke in that flat, easy cadence. "We can't have her decision stand," he said. "Not when it threatens the whole program. We need it handled discreetly." Another voice answered, lower and more deliberate. It was a man who'd been at the center of power for years, but who had never been publicly linked to violence. Judge Leonard Hayes. Leonard's voice on the tape was softer than anyone remembered from a bench. It had the calm of someone who believed he was above consequence. "And," he said, "what do you propose?" Gideon's answer was the chilling thing the sentence prosecutors had said would haunt men in office for years. "We pull the problem. We get someone who knows how to do a job without making it about us. We can make sure it looks like an isolated act. You know the type." That was the phrase. "You know the type," that dropped like a stone in the room. People shifted in their seats. Jodi's mother made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, and then she covered her mouth with both hands. The tape continued. The voices discussed payments, an account that would show up as consulting fees, a contractor who would pass envelopes, and a man they both called. In a different way, men lower their voices about unpleasant tasks, the solution. The prosecutor let it play without commentary while the room rearranged itself around the new reality. A judge, the highest symbol of the law in that county, had been caught on a recording discussing the removal of a judge's opponent, and the method suggested was crude and criminal. The whispers began immediately. "Is that really? They can't. It must be doctored." Sound analysts would later testify that the recording had not been doctored. The patterns of speech, the subsonic timbre, the cadence of breath between phrases, all matched the voices pulled from phone calls with recorded consent months earlier. The lab report was meticulous. Gideon Price's voice matched. Judge Leonard Hayes's voice matched. The microphones had picked up the click of Gideon's lighter in the background. Gideon always kept a lighter in his right pocket, witnesses later said, And once it was heard on the tape, it sounded like a callous verification. Arrests followed. Gideon Price was taken from his home a few days after the hearing. He went quietly, a towel around his shoulders as his wife watched in a doorway. A neighbor calling out his name as if that might undo his cuffs. Commissioner Arthur Bellamy, the man who'd been listed in some of the old invoices, resigned on live television. His face washed to the color he once had. Judge Hayes was put on administrative leave. The Judicial Oversight Committee convened an emergency session in the state capitol. The town that had once assumed the law, protected it, now watched the law place its own in the dock. For a moment, the feeling in Charleston convinced people it had been a year's worth of breaths, all exhaled at once. There were vigils, candlelight, and the kind of old-fashioned outrage that felt cleansing. Jodi's mother walked through the same courthouse steps she had sat on for years like an old friend, and when she spoke to the press, she did so in small, clear sentences. "I wanted to know who ordered my daughter's death," she said. "I wanted to know if someone in that building thought they could take a life because it was convenient. I didn't want to be right about it." But the calm was brittle. The prosecution's strategy to keep the recording sealed until they could be used without jeopardizing Luke's conviction had been a gamble. The recording's release meant a retrial was possible. The defense filed motions to overturn the conviction on grounds that the new evidence implicated different pathways to blame, and appeals courts, twisting slowly through bureaucratic tangles, began to unspool verdicts and judgments. The criminal justice machine, which had once seemed so confident, now looked like a watch whose parts might fit, but whose spring was broken. And then the thing no one expected happened. Gideon Price, while awaiting arraignment in the county lockup, died. It was ruled a suicide, an overdose of a combination his physician had warned him about before. He had written a note, they said. The note admitted to arranging a problem, but insisted he had only ever meant to frighten the person, not to take a life. He wrote with the smug humility of someone trying to edit his own final chapter. "Forgive me," the note said. "I never thought it would go that far." People were stunned. Some felt relief that one of the main players could no longer speak. Others smelled something else. Complications. The way old systems try to close the circle before their own rut is exposed. There were rumors that Gideon had been protected for years by others who shared his knowledge. There were whispers that his death had been too clean, too convenient. Jodi's mother did not attend the funeral. She said later she would not be part of the theater of someone's repentance without truth. The investigations widened. Prosecutors searched Gideon's account and found, tucked between invoices and travel expenses, a list of names. Not all of them public officials, but men who had access, influence, and motive. Some names matched contracts. Others returned to seedier ledgers that recorded payoffs and favors. It was not enough to convict anyone else beyond a reasonable doubt, but the pattern was ugly and undeniable. Multiple projects had benefited from decisions made in the weeks around Jodi's case, and those projects had generated profits that, in some instances, could be traced into the hands of middlemen who had a history of doing jobs for people who could not be seen doing them themselves. The town smelled betrayal in its own institutions. The downtown diners' regulars, half of them retired city employees, spoke in a new register. The word systemic was used not in academic papers, but as if it had always been simmering under their plates. People who had once been content to let small corruptions slide began to ask pointed questions at council meetings. Reverend Samuel Pierce, who had long been the town's most eloquent moral voice, called for a special assembly. People came, their faces set, their expectations heavy. Then the darker pattern began to show up not on spreadsheets, but in boxes and files that Maya found in an abandoned storage locker. The same locker that had produced some of Gideon's earlier ledgers. Amongst the dusty receipts and former project blueprints were photographs. Grainy, half-broken images of women at local hearings, at courthouse steps, at cafes where municipal employees often met quietly. The photos were annotated in Gideon's hand. Next to some names were amounts. Next to others were dates and shorthand. There were not many photographs, but what Maya noticed made her stomach drop. The images compiled over a decade. Some women were from other towns. Some had never been named in any previous investigation. Maya called her editor and, after a long pause, called Jodi's mother. "There's a list," she said. "It's not just Jodi." For days, the newsroom felt like a place poised on a cliff. Callers poured in. People who had been on the periphery of municipal life suddenly found themselves in the spotlight. Some wanted to tell their stories. Others wanted to be left alone. A retired city planner said he remembered hearing about problems that had been made to disappear, but he had never connected those disappearances to deaths. He'd assumed they were simple withdrawals, the sort of petty corruption that small towns shrug off. Now the pattern took on an entirely different texture. The legal consequences moved slowly, and in that slowness new fractures emerged. Luke Ramsey's lawyers filed motions claiming that the people who had arranged the murder had been shielded by those in power. They argued that their client had been a tool, and if a tool had been put in motion by men such as Gideon and the judge, then his culpability should be mitigated. The prosecution, bruised by its own revelations, argued it had acted on the best science available in 2002 and the best investigations now. The appeals courts handled the motions cautiously. The county's reputation, such as it was, hung in the balance. Public trust frayed. People stopped attending civic events in the same numbers. Boards that once met in old rooms behind courthouse doors began to open windows to the public. There were resignations, but those who were truly implicated kept their silence and their sofas in the same houses. It felt as if the town had been stripped of an old kindness that had been part of its identity. The kindness that allowed a neat arrangement of social roles without too many uncomfortable questions. 2 years after Gideon's death, and after a string of press conferences that made the town feel like an open wound, Maya received a package on a rain-heavy Thursday. There was no return address. Inside, wrapped in paper that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and lemon oil, was a sealed USB drive and a note pinned to it with a paperclip. The note had one sentence: "You wanted the whole truth." Maya's hands trembled as she plugged the drive into her laptop in the dead hour before dawn. There were a dozen files, each labeled with a date and a shorthand. She clicked the first. It was a video, low-light footage from inside a private room where a group of men sat around a table. The image was grainy, the kind of night vision green that steals warmth from a face. One by one the men's faces came into focus. There was Gideon, his face older and softer than the recordings. There was a man she recognized from the town social pages, a philanthropist who'd built playgrounds and given his name to scholarship funds. There was Mayor Bellamy, scowling in the corner. There were men from contractors who had bid on projects that had been suddenly rerouted in 2002. The camera lingered on one more face. It was Judge Hayes, far less composed than he had appeared in court. He leaned forward, and in the poor audio of the video, the camera captured his words. "It's a small town," he said. "We don't let problems fester. We remove them quietly. We keep our hands clean." The next file was an audio file labeled 2002 Follow-Up. It contained Gideon's voice, then the judge's, and then a third voice, lower, almost a whisper. It was a man everyone in Charleston respected and trusted in a way that was almost private. Reverend Samuel Pierce. His voice was calm. "We must protect what we've built," he said. "This woman's decision threatens families. It threatens jobs. It threatens faith in our leadership. There was silence, and then a sound that was not a voice. A glass put down slowly. The scrape of chair on tile. The video cut out. Maya felt the room tilt. She thought of Jodi's mother's hands, the way she had held the funeral program like an anchor. She thought of Luke Ramsey in his cell, and of Gideon's neat note, of Judge Hayes' quiet voice. The list, the ledger, the boxes, they had all been pieces of a puzzle that did not show a single malicious man, but a network of men who had built a system that turned decisions into threats, and threats into payments, and payments into quiet solutions. The tape made it clear that what happened to Jodi had not been a random act of rage. It had been an option chosen by people who had assumed they could manage outcomes the same way they managed budgets. Maya sat back and pressed her palms to her eyes. She knew what this meant. Releasing it would incinerate reputations and maybe begin a process of reckoning. Holding on to it risked becoming part of the same silence that had allowed Jodi's life to be taken. She called Jodi's mother and asked if she wanted to come into the newsroom. The sheet of paper inside the envelope contained only the words, "Not finished." The implication was impossible to ignore. It suggested a continuity that had nothing to do with arrests and everything to do with the way men who build systems of silence do not die with the men who first made them. Someone had kept the machinery going even after Gideon was gone, had kept a list of possibilities and a method of operation. The bird bath, a place people fed pigeons and tossed messages into on a whim, had become a bulletin board for someone with a grimmer purpose. The county moved into a new phase of fear. People began to lock their doors at night in ways they hadn't before. Public meetings were gated and screened. When the mayor, whose resignation had been long demanded by some, chose to stay, he found his mailbox filled with anonymous notes. The elderly woman who ran the corner store found one morning that her fence had been spray-painted with a word that meant, in the old idiom, "Don't you forget this." The most chilling moment came a week later, when Jodi's mother received a mailed package with no return address. Inside was a small framed photograph. It was a picture of Jodi on a spring day in 2002. The sunlight on her hair, the courthouse steps behind her. On the back of the frame, in a neat hand, someone had written, "We set the pieces. She moved them. She paid." The handwriting was the same as Gideon's. There are moments in which contempt disguises itself as a final lesson. The man or men who sent that photograph were telling the town that the mechanisms they had employed to protect themselves had been taught and perhaps still operated. The message was a cruel one. You can indict us, you can take us to court, you can lock the ones you catch behind bars, but you cannot unlearn the system. It will be taught to others in quieter ways by people who think silence is a form of stewardship. That night, Jodi's mother went home and sat on her kitchen floor. She held the frame to her chest like it was a child. She whispered into the quiet apartment where she had raised a daughter and watched a life of law and rhetoric bloom, and then be extinguished in the blink of a choice. Was she ever safe? She asked the photograph. The photograph could not answer, but she heard in the rustle of the curtains the city breathing around her like an animal that had not been allowed to rest. The final chapter of the case did not provide a clean scream of closure or a tidy banquet of confessions. It provided instead a revelation that was worse. The systems that had protected the guilty remained partially intact, and their lessons had diffused into the edges of community life. People began to look at one another in ways that had not been possible before, with suspicion, with grief, and with a hard, practical question of what they might do to prevent a recurrence. The courts continued to do what courts do. Men were sentenced. Some went to prison. Some took plea deals. The legal reckoning, as it had always been, was an arithmetic of facts and evidence, not the ledger of conscience that so many had hoped for. The moral reckoning was slower and more uneven, lived out in school boardrooms and grocery store lines, in the way parents whispered to their children about who to trust, and in petitions filed to audit public contracts. And then one quietly devastating morning, an envelope arrived at the newsroom addressed to Maya. Inside was a single photograph and the same 2 words Gideon had used in his ledger. The photograph showed a group of people in a room, their faces turned toward the camera. The men in the front were people the town had once trusted publicly. The mayor, the superintendent, a banker. The men in the back were contractors and small-time fixers. Standing in the middle, smiling in a way that was almost casual, was Reverend Samuel Pierce. On the back of the photograph in Gideon's handwriting, someone had written, "We start with the ones the town will forgive." Maya felt cold. She thought of Jodi's voice, not just the woman who had died, but the lawyer who had, in life, spoken for those without voices. She thought of the moment Jodi had walked out of the courthouse in 2002, a folder of papers under her arm, and how fragile a moment like that could be when others chose to place their own needs above a person's life. She realized then, with a kind of painful clarity, that the town's true shock was not the revelation of who had been making decisions in secret. It was a discovery that the choices had been made in the folded, polite tissue of everyday civility, after church, over coffee among friends, and that those choices had been taught to others as practical solutions rather than as crimes. The ledger had been a manual. The recordings had been proof. The arrests had been incremental. In the end, the town felt what it always feels when it learns that the foundation beneath its community has been undermined, unmoored. They had to decide how to go forward. Some people left, taking their trust with them. Others stayed and organized. They formed oversight committees and taught civic classes to high schoolers on transparency. The courthouse installed a new security system. Contracts were required to make public the names of subcontractors. The school board created a hotline for reporting conflicts of interest. But systems mend slowly, if they mend at all. The death of Gideon Price and the arrests that followed had exposed a moral rut that had metastasized into institutions. And you cannot simply stitch a town back together with ordinances and new stamps. The ledger's last page, the one that had condemned Evelyn Hart and made the town's children ask hard questions, had been photographed and published in a local paper. People read it and could not unsee the ink. Years would pass. Some names would become a whisper of history. Others would remain stains on resumes and the memories of those who had trusted. Luke Ramsey would live the rest of his life under the weight of what he had done, and the small mercy of his sentence would be measured against the larger, more terrible truth that had come from men and institutions who had treated people as expendable. The last chilling realization that stitched itself into the town's memory was perhaps the worst of all. The ledger, the recordings, the videos, they had not captured all of it. There were gaps, and those gaps were like wounds that would fester unless someone, somewhere, continued to pry at them. In a town where trust had been currency and silence its treasury, the breaking of that trust left people with 2 choices: live in a community of quiet collusion or build one of painful accountability. Jodi Greene's name would never stop being spoken in Charleston, sometimes softly, sometimes in anger, sometimes in the way mothers say their child's name at bedtime, as if calling them into being. People lit candles, signed petitions, and taught their children why a verdict is not the same as a truth. They learned the hard lesson that law can punish a single act, but cannot always map the moral architecture that enabled it. And in a small, ordinary house not far from the courthouse, a house where the blind stayed drawn more often than not, Jodi's mother kept a photo of her daughter on the mantel. She turned the frame so its back was always facing outward. She wrote in the margin of Jodi's funeral program, in handwriting that had steadied with age, one sentence: remember the name, remember the cost. Late one night, months after the mayor's resignation and years after Gideon's death, someone left a note on her doorstep. It was typed, precise, and contained no address. The note read, "We remember. We will finish what we started." Below that line, in Gideon's handwriting, were two words: not finished. The town learned its final lesson in the way the wind learns the shape of a house, slowly, inevitably, and with the knowledge that some drafts never leave. The systems that had protected men would be dismantled and rebuilt. New policies would arise and be fought for like young blades. But the true chilling thing, the thing that would haunt the town in years to come, was not the legal fallout or the broken reputations. It was that the ledger, the recordings, and the videos had shown that murder had once been treated like a management decision, and that somewhere in some hand, the little book of arrangements still sat, waiting for the next time a man decided he had a problem that needed to be made to disappear. The last image I left the newsroom with that night was of Jodi's mother closing her front door and standing for a long moment with the photograph of her daughter pressed to her chest. Outside, the town hummed with its small lives. Inside her home, she turned the photo over and read the back again. The same crisp paper, the same handwriting. Not finished. It was not a promise, exactly. It was more like a warning that the quiet human arrangements of power are not erased by trials, and that the moral work of a town continues long after the gavel falls. Before you go, make sure to hit subscribe, tap like, and turn on notifications. That way you'll never miss the next mystery cold case we uncover together. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I appreciate every single one of you for supporting this journey.